Good evening. I'm John Connolly. I'm the principal of Millburn Middle School, and I want to welcome you to this evening's One Millburn Community Conversation. This evening is a continuation of our work with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within the Millburn Township Public Schools. Tonight's One Millburn event is a recognition of our need to continue to acknowledge, recognize, and address the importance of appreciating, empathizing, and respecting our community's cultural diversity. To moderate our One Millburn event, I want to introduce former Board of Education President, Mr. Jeff Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Is that on? Thank you, Mr. Connolly. The lowering of the microphone is a lifelong affliction. I want to say good evening and welcome you to One Millburn. As a former Board of Education member and Board of Education President, the well-being of our community and our school system and our children is still of great importance to me, and I was honored to be asked to moderate this important event. I'd like to start the evening by welcoming current Board of Ed President, Mr. Louis Shen.
Thank you, Jeff. On behalf of the Board of Education, I'd like to welcome everyone, our distinguished guests and members of the Millburn community. We want to thank you for attending and supporting our school district's ongoing effort to build a culture that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as evidenced by our emphasis upon those terms in our district goals. We are proud to bring this event to Millburn tonight, and we really thank you for your coming here, participating, and we look forward to a future partnership in One Millburn. Thank you.
I'm sorry, why did it take so long for Millburn to do this? Why did it take anti-Semitism, racism, for our children to have to hear the word, that's the Jews, for this to happen?
First of all, I do feel if you're very angry about hearing those terms, we share that angst. I think in the past few years, I think we all understand we went through a lot of challenges as a community. And the incidents did not rise to a level, and the severity of the incidents while we received certain reportings has never reached a certain level that's so alarming. That's why when we receive certain reports, when we see certain terms, we put into action immediately. During the virtual years, apparently there was no such incident reported. And it was the majority of our effort while we put an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion all the time. Maybe our work needs more. And this is our sincere effort to start that conversation and try to see what else we can do. And we want to do the best job we can. Thank you. And I'm sure as Jeff comes back on, we'll have more opportunities to ask those questions, and we'll address the concerns as best as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Let me just say, I think everybody got a card on the way in. If you want to write your questions out, at some point we'll call for them to be collected, and we will use them later on in the program. Next, I'd like to welcome Millburn Mayor Maggie Miggins.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening. I would like to thank the Millburn School District for bringing the community together and for initiating this collective effort to make us One Millburn. As a member of the Township Committee and currently serving as the mayor, we are here to encourage and celebrate our diverse community. I also want you to know that Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill's office, she reached out to me personally, and she has sent someone here this evening she couldn't make it, but she did send someone from her field office who will then be reporting back to her. She thinks this is a very important topic, and she's most encouraged that the school district has brought us all together. I'd like to thank the school district for inviting me. I look forward to tonight's panel and our continued partnership with One Millburn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Miggins. Now I'd like to welcome our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Christine Burton, to help set the stage for the evening.
Good evening, and I too want to thank you for taking the time this evening for this very important One Millburn event. Since COVID, we have seen an increase in code of conduct violations, including disruptive student behavior and the use of inappropriate language and expression, whereby we have seen students engaging in peer-to-peer conversations and incidents involving deliberate use of disturbing, anti-Semitic, and racist words. The use of such words deliberately targeting specific groups has a long and devastating history with reference to centuries of genocidal hate. We've disciplined students for incidents targeting the ethnicity, gender identity, body image, and other bullying of peers. We have dealt with students in both in and out of school who have made verbal assaults and engaged in conversations that have targeted and marginalized their peers. And we've discovered students accessing online apps, social media, and websites that are targeting students and promoting bias, hate, and prejudice. These incidents of racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian, and other derogatory statements are hate speech and do not represent the culture of our community. They are inexcusable and unacceptable in Millburn schools and in Millburn, period. Millburn Short Hills is an evolving community encompassing many different cultures, identities, ethnicities, and religions. Our diverse and inclusive makeup is our greatest strength. Together, we will work as One Millburn to embrace our diversity and make Millburn a safe place to live, learn, and grow. So our goal for this work is to acknowledge that hate speech, expressions, and behaviors exist in our community, recognize what and why it is pervasive, and ultimately to formulate next steps as actions as One Millburn. I do want to set a reminder that per the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act compliance measure, also known as FERPA, we cannot share any details that personally identify information about students or about specific incidents. Tonight is a discussion that is the beginning of One Millburn through a community dialogue, and we'll be hearing from our panelists regarding this work and how we can take on further bold conversations about important topics that build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community with a culture of belonging in Millburn. To set the stage for the critical undertaking this evening, I'd like to read the poem that was shared by one of our panelists, Dr. Wafia Salim, entitled Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scape Jones. Invitation to Brave Space. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world and amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and to continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So as you enter this evening, you had the opportunity to take a card that you can write a question that you have for our panelists. Someone will come around and to collect them as the time permits. And we share them with the panelists later this evening. Please know that these questions will help to inform future conversations as our work moves forward. And at this time, I want to turn it back over to Jeff to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. Joining us on our panel this evening are, first, Mr. Scott Richmond. Mr. Richmond serves as the Director for Anti-Defamation League's largest regional office covering New York and New Jersey. His work includes incident response, anti-bias education, legislative initiatives, educational programs, fundraising, and leadership development. He hosts a weekly national podcast called From the Front Lines. Mr. Richmond. Our next panelist is Dr. Wafia Salim. Dr. Salim is the founder of She Matters, a culturally responsive movement to end gender-based violence. She serves as the Chief Wellness Officer of the Hub Arts and Trauma Center in Newark, New Jersey, and consultant facilitator for New Jersey Child Welfare Training Programs of Rutgers School of Social Work. She has partnered with multiple agencies as a consultant, facilitator for interactive trainings, and curator of courageous healing circles. Dr. Salim. Our third panelist is Mr. Sandeep Iyer. Mr. Iyer is Director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and leads the state agency charged with enforcing New Jersey civil rights laws. He previously served as Assistant Attorney General and Senior Counsel to Attorney General Matthew Platkin. In that capacity, he was the Attorney General's principal advisor on civil rights matters and coordinated department-wide civil rights initiatives. Mr. Iyer. Questions for the panelists are asked from the list developed with our advisory committee. As time remains, we will ask questions from the audience. The first question concerns awareness. Can you talk broadly about the acts of hate and bias that you are seeing across the state and nationwide? Let's start with you, Mr. Richmond.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And it's an honor to be on this panel with Sandeep and Wafia, and of course, it's an honor to speak with all of you this evening. ADL is an organization that is known for tracking data. Data drives policy. It's very important to what we do. We track data not only from other organizations, but our own data as well. So I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly about hate in general, and then focus very specifically on anti-Semitism. In terms of the broad numbers, we rely on the FBI hate crimes data. That's sort of seen as the benchmark, and Millburn is not alone. Unfortunately, FBI hate crimes data shows that hate crimes are the worst we've seen in 20 years, in 2 decades. That's the current situation. This isn't just about the Jewish community. It's about the Black community, the Asian community, the LGBTQ plus community. These are the communities that are targeted the most. There are other communities, but for sure, those are the communities that are targeted the most. New Jersey is not immune to this. We see, and I'm sure Sandeep is going to speak to this, the bias report that's put out by the Attorney General's office, the latest bias report put out by the Attorney General's office mirrors that in terms of Black community, Jewish community, Asian community, and the LGBTQ plus community as being the biggest victims in terms of bias incidents. And we see that the situation, the numbers The latest numbers that were put out are the worst since 1994. So that's sort of the backdrop. In terms of anti-Semitism, obviously ADL takes the lead when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism. We play a very strong allyship role when it comes to other forms of hate, very important for us. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, we take the lead in combating that. The situation with regard to anti-Semitism is obviously something we know well, and we know it well because we respond to anti-Semitic incidents. That is the work of my office, literally responding to anti-Semitic incidents every day of the week. Unfortunately, that's the world we're in right now. We respond to those incidents by working with victims, by working with law enforcement, by working with social media and K-12 schools and workplace and wherever it happens to be taking place. Once a year, we compile that data. This is from across the nation. I'm the director of one office. We have 25 offices of ADL. Once a year, we compile that data, and that's the way we look at the state of anti-Semitism in this country. It's not a survey. Many organizations, we also do surveys. A survey would be out there and talking about, are you experiencing anti-Semitism? Are you worried about it? That's not what this is. This is what ADL encountered in the field in the year before as a way to take the temperature. We've been doing this since 1979, and since 1979, last year was the worst year on record, 43 years of data. Not only was it the worst year on record, but it was 5 times the number in 2013. So it's very important to understand that we date this rise, not just in anti-Semitism, but in all forms of hate, to about a decade ago. We began seeing the numbers began to go up. That's the situation we're dealing with now. So a 500% increase since 2013 in terms of what we dealt with. And if we look across the nation, there is no state that has more anti-Semitic incidents than New York, followed very closely by New Jersey. Last year, New Jersey was number 3. California squeezed in there, but the year before, New Jersey was number 2. 25% of the incidents across the entire nation take place in New York and New Jersey. So that's unfortunately what we're dealing with, including a great number of assaults, physical violence against Jews, really more than any other area across the nation.
Mr. Heyer?
First of all, I just want to echo Scott in extending my appreciation to you all for having us here. It's an honor to be with you to talk about these incredibly important topics. Just to build on some of the great numbers that Scott just laid out, our office, the Division on Civil Rights, in partnership with the State Police and the Division on Criminal Justice within the Office of the Attorney General, put out every year a bias incident report that goes through how many bias incidents we've seen in the past year across our state. And that includes every incident that's reported at the local level, to the state, to the county prosecutor's offices. I do just want to pause 1 second on something I just said there, reported, because we know that only a fraction of the bias incidents that happen across the state, across the country, ever even get reported in the first place. So the numbers that we're talking about are just a fraction of what we're seeing out in our communities. But just with reported bias incidents, as Scott mentioned, every year we've been setting new records here in New Jersey for the number of bias incidents that we're seeing in our communities. In 2022, we have preliminary figures that suggest there were about 2,100 recorded bias incidents across the state. That's a 30% increase over the year before, which, by the way, was itself a record. So year on year, we're breaking the record by a considerable margin. It's really not close. And since 2019, between 2019 and 2022, 3 years, that number of bias incidents has doubled. It's gone from around 1,000 across the state to well over 2,000. And we're seeing that increase across every single targeted group. Anti-Black, bias incidents, almost 1,000 in 2022, which again was a record. Anti-Jewish bias incidents, almost 500 across our state in 2022. And that's consistent with the broader numbers, about a 30% rise. And it's not close. Again, it's the highest number we've ever seen in our statistics. And this is true across just about every single targeted group: anti-LGBTQ plus incidents, anti-Asian, anti-Muslim. So we've got a real challenge on this issue. And I know you all know it well here in Millburn, but unfortunately, Millburn is not alone in this. And we're seeing this in every corner of our state. And I think some of the increase, I think a small portion of that increase, is because we're doing a better job of reporting. We're doing a better job of trying to encourage people to report. But I think there are also a lot of other factors at play, some of which we're going to talk about later tonight, whether it's social media, whether it's the rise of white supremacy and the rise of political polarization. There are a whole bunch of factors that have contributed to this, but all of them have created a kind of perfect storm where we're continuing to see year on year a substantial increase in the number of bias incidents we're seeing.
Okay, Dr. Salim.
Good evening. Am I on? Yeah, okay. Good evening, Millburn community. First, I just want to say thank you for taking the courageous step to really embark upon this grand challenge, right? And it's not just a challenge for Millburn, but it's actually a challenge that we as a nation, as a U.S. nation, is faced with. And so we get to do it together. And I want to kind of echo what the gentlemen have shared. Those numbers are alarming. And I just want to distill it so that we can identify it in terms of where we are and who in the community we're with, right? And so the statistic shows that 1 in 4 youth will experience bullying, right? 1 in 4 youth. So when we begin to think about numbers, right? So the numbers that were first shared, they were large numbers. And so sometimes you can't really see yourself or see your children in those numbers, but I'm going to distill them a bit. 1 in 4 youth experience bullying, right? And just sit with that for a minute. 1 in 4 report seeing words and symbols of homophobic, such as homophobic slurs. And so it's really important to when we think about numbers, begin to think about people, begin to think about youth, and begin to think about what our contribution is and what we can do to actually shift this conversation. So numbers are critically important. It's important to know data, but what are we going to do with that data? And that's the discussion we're up to this evening. And so I just want us to sit with, let's begin to be relational around this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before you can, I just want to echo something that Sandeep said, because it's really important here. And he won't say it because it's his agency and agencies that he works with, but the state of New Jersey is a model state when it comes to reporting of hate crimes and hate incidents. We talk about what New Jersey does all the time in other states. Attorney General Graywall, a prior Attorney General, made it a real priority to put in place protocols for reporting hate crimes, the kinds of protocols that don't exist elsewhere. So you should be very proud of that.
So following up as Scott, as you started, the first question that popped into my head was, about the numbers, and I'm a numbers person, as a lot of people know me, know that, was, what was the contour of that increase? Did it just kind of grow a little bit and then pop in the last year or two, or how did that unfold? And therefore, do you have any kind of diagnosis or feeling about what the triggers were? And you touched on it, I think, a little bit, but I think it's a really important question. Can you elaborate on, your own feelings or work? I'm guessing you've all discussed this in your offices. What are the triggers? What is causing this inflection point?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can both take it, Scott. I think Scott and I often compare notes on this, so I suspect our answers will be somewhat similar. I think we're seeing exponential growth, particularly over the last couple of years, as Scott pointed out, 500% increase since 2013 is enormous. A doubling since 2019 is enormous. And I think that there are a lot of things that have happened in the last 10 years that have contributed. I don't think it's any one single factor, but you look across the country right now, and we're 2.5 years removed from a white supremacist assault on the US Capitol. We look at social media, and you see white supremacy, you see hate proliferating. And I think it's a particular challenge in this context when we're talking about our schools and our kids, because increasingly our kids are online and are exposed to everything that is out there on social media. So I think those are just two of the factors. I think the pandemic also exacerbated some of these trends. I think we see that particularly with anti-Asian bias and hate. There was a lot of scapegoating that happened around the pandemic that contributed. And so I think there's a whole host of factors that have led us to this point. And unfortunately, I think those factors are not ones that are fleeting. They are things that we are going to have to contend with year in, year out for the foreseeable future.
I would agree with Sandeep, and I'll just add a little bit to that. Certainly when we talk about a 500% increase since 2013, we're not talking about short-term factors. Yes, COVID, yes, the economy, people look for scapegoats when it comes to those things, but these are longer-term societal factors. It's not just affecting one group, it's affecting all of these different groups. So social media certainly is an enormous driver of hate. I mean, that's just a fact. You know, social media does a lot of good. It gives people a voice. It democratizes society. Really important. But it also gives haters a voice. It gives them the megaphone that they didn't have before. You know, traditionally somebody has a hateful idea and they would need to find a newspaper, television station, radio station that would want to put that out there. And what happens when you do that? Invariably, those newspaper, television, radio, they would say, sorry, this does not fit with our values. They would push that hate to the margins of society. That's traditionally the way that hate is controlled. Civil society plays a role by pushing hate to the margins of society. With social media, you don't need to do that. And if you think about the birth of social media, you know, 2004 with Facebook, and those early years, there were no policies in place to control this. We have what's known as content moderation policies now. But those policies began to come into play 2015, 2016. So think about these dates. Think about something like Holocaust denial. So Holocaust denial was permitted on Facebook up until 2020. October 2020, less than 3 years ago. So, you know, these policies are relatively new, and that's what's controlling these social media companies. You know, it's completely self-regulated. There is no government regulation of social media. And I'll add to that, social media gives people, haters, a way to find others who share their hateful ideas. That was very hard in the past. It gives people a way to radicalize others. You know, I spent 3 days in Buffalo following the horrific tragedy there. And I went there for many reasons, but I was certainly went first and foremost to show my solidarity with the Black community, which was attacked. But one of the things I ended up doing was answering a lot of questions about social media, a lot of questions about the great replacement theory, which people hadn't heard of before, this horrific notion that Black and brown people are coming to this country to replace the white people. So, you know, this idea of radicalizing somebody through social media was constantly brought up. And you know, I had to explain to people, this is because people would ask me, how is it that a young man who lived hours away, who was not going down this path, would decide to do this? And I explained the power of social media. But it's more than that. It's also about polarization. You know, we live in an increasingly divided society. a society where people take sides. And when people take sides, it's very hard to control hate. Hate is something that you need a strong center to control. When people take sides, they say everything on my side is correct. Everything on my side is right, and everything on the other side is wrong. And you can't have that. People on the left need to control hate on the left, and people on the right need to control hate on the right. And if they're not willing to do it because they don't want to give a benefit to the other side, then hate begins to move towards the center. And that's the situation we're in, and it continues to get worse. And the last thing I'll say is that we're in a moment of increasing emboldening of extremists. We see this all the time. Extremists on both sides, the left and the right, where the sort of social censure that existed in the past is simply not there. And perhaps the most visible manifestation of this in New Jersey and elsewhere is white supremacist propaganda. You see white supremacist propaganda now all the time, talking about stickering and flyering and banner drops. You may have seen this flyering episode in Plainview, which happened over the weekend. So this is a virulently anti-Semitic white supremacist group that left flyers on people's lawns, completely randomly, on dozens and dozens of lawns, blaming Jews for the ills of society. It's horrific, but this is something that is now very, very common. Yes, it happened in New Jersey. It happened not in Millburn, but this is an entity called the Goyim Defense League that left these flyers. But it happened in New Jersey last year. It happened in other parts of the region. This is something we're seeing very frequently. ADL keeps track of this. In 2017, we saw 12 incidents of white supremacist propaganda in the state of New Jersey. That has increased by more than 10 times. It's now very common. Groups like the New Jersey European Heritage Association, the Patriot Front, the White Lives Matter movement, different groups who are very active. This sort of social censure that existed, that genie is out of the bottle. A lot of factors affecting the rise in hate. Those are just some of them.
We're going to circle back to social media again and attack that directly, but thank you for those thoughts. Let's move on to our next question, which concerns recognition. Why is it important to name specific incidents of hate? For example, anti-Semitism, racism, anti-LGBTQ+, body shaming, etc., rather than simply referring to them generically as hate incidents? Mr. Iyer, you want to start on that?
I think there are a couple of different reasons to recognize who is the target of a specific hate or bias incident. For one thing, hate and bias doesn't happen in a vacuum. It builds on a prior history of hate and bias. And so when we talk about anti-Semitic language or anti-Black acts of violence, those things are happening in a specific social context and in a broader historical context that all of us need to be aware of. And that context varies depending on who the target is of the hate or bias incident. The causes are also different. White supremacists might target the Jewish community, they might target the Black community, they might target the Latino community, and they might do it for different reasons. They might be motivated by the Great Replacement theory, for example, in targeting one particular group. They might be motivated by other kinds of propaganda when targeting a separate group. And it's important for all of us to recognize what the source is of the bias so that we can try and address that underlying root source as well. And the last thing I'll say on this is we need to also recognize that folks who are the target of hate and bias aren't just experiencing it as hate or bias generically. They're experiencing it in a very visceral way that is intimately linked to who they are as a person or what they believe in. And it's that connection, that visceral connection, that makes hate and bias so powerful and so devastating for communities. And I think it frankly sanitizes what we're talking about when we just talk about it as hate and bias. And I think breaking this out and understanding who the specific victims are when you're talking about a particular incident matters a great deal in understanding what the impact of that incident is going to be.
Dr. Salim?
And I just want to support what the information that you just shared. I think it's important to know the distinctions between hate and bias, right? And so the truth is, all of us to a degree have some biases, right? And so if you're familiar with implicit biases, and so that means that there's a time when you will prefer, there's a preference to a particular aside, right? And so hate is really geared by fear, and hate is connected to harm, it's connected to power, it's connected to control. And so when we're talking about hate, we really need to understand how it is systemized, right? And how hateful incidents and hate crimes, and what makes it so bold is that it's connected oftentimes to racism, like we said, bigotry, sexism, homophobic. And so oftentimes historically, there's a system that supports it. And so what we're really here to talk about is how do we get to dismantle that and really get back to knowing the distinction between biases and hate, and how we can really eliminate hate, right? And so it's really important for us to know that.
So the only thing that I would add is that it is really important to understand the form of social prejudice that you're talking about. Social prejudice manifests in unique ways, whether it's anti-Semitism or attacks against the LGBTQ community, violence against Asians. There are unique manifestations of this. And obviously, if it's a real attack, everybody's up in arms. But if it's like a microaggression or stereotyping, these are different and these are pernicious, and these can lead to much worse situations. And without understanding the particular aspects of how that manifests itself, it's very hard to combat it. It's also very hard to be an ally. If you're looking to be an ally to that particular group. I mean, you take something like anti-Semitism. You know, anti-Semitism manifests itself as a series of conspiracy theories or tropes. There are actually 7 of them. They're very distinct. They don't look like any other form of social prejudice, like the trope of power or influence. Jews have an undue amount of influence. They're in control of government or media or business. Jews are particularly wealthy. That's the second trope. You know, Jews are not loyal to the local community. They're loyal only to the Jewish community, or they're not loyal to the United States. They're loyal to Israel. These are manifestations that you hear, and understanding the way it manifests itself is very important to be able to combat it. It's also you hear tropes, you know, attacks against the Asian community in terms of their loyalty. Or connections to other countries, things like this. These are things that need to be called out in an individual way and not lumped together as being forms of hate.
And just want to speak to naming, why naming is so important. Naming also gives us an opportunity towards healing, right? And so oftentimes when you're unable to name a trauma or name a thing, it's you can't actually begin to the work of healing or the work of reconciliation. And so that's why today it's really important to call it out for what it is. And that way you get to the nature of it. You also name the history behind it. And that way we can move towards what we can reimagine something new. And so naming gives us access to healing. I just wanted to make sure I stated that.
You used the word pernicious, and it made me think that about my own experience. I'm guessing a lot of people have had that, but just in business situations, people who are clients of or even friends of mine will sometimes use these, in my case, you know, or I'm more sensitive to it, these more subtle anti-Semitic tropes. In many cases, because I think it's so ingrained, they wouldn't do it intentionally to hurt me, but I think it's just, some of these things are so ingrained in them, they don't even realize that these are some things that are harmful. And I'm thinking about like the statistics you're talking about, the things that elevate to you are much more serious incidents, right? But those things built from somewhere, right? Which is this day-to-day pernicious thing. You know, do you want to comment on that, or do you think that that's?
Yeah, I just add to that. I think the reality that we see, and ADL has done a fantastic job of documenting this, is that people who commit violent acts of hate don't start by immediately going to violence. It starts with what some people perceive as harmless, the joke, the microaggression that often, too often, goes uncorrected. And I think hate is the sort of thing that builds over time. It can start with a joke, it can start with a small comment, and it can snowball over time. And so I think that reflects the critical importance of responding to even the small comments when you hear them, because that's ultimately, I think, essential if we're going to stop hate from becoming the even more powerful force that we all too often see it become.
Sandeep is 100% correct, and we have a construct. You can look it up. It's called the pyramid of hate. We talk about it a lot in our education programs in K-12 schools and our anti-bias programs. Pyramid of hate is a construct that says you have to stop hate at the bottom of the pyramid because it can very easily rise up. Obviously, with microaggressions, with stereotyping, can lead to discrimination, can lead to violence, ultimately to the Holocaust, genocide. You know, Holocaust didn't start with the Holocaust. It started with, much lower down on the pyramid. And that's why it's very important to speak out about it. Now, you mentioned about pernicious forms of hate. If you think about some of the conspiracy theories that I mentioned before, the mechanics of that are interesting, because usually with social prejudice is about putting people down, making them feel lower than you. But if you think about something like the trope of power or influence, you're actually elevating a person. You're saying they have undue control, undue power. Or the trope of greed, Jews are particularly wealthy. That's a problem, because what happens is when people use those stereotypes, they often excuse it by saying, oh, I was just complimenting the Jewish community. I was just saying something nice about that individual. And that's okay in isolation, in a complete vacuum, but we don't live in a vacuum. And what happens is that kind of stereotyping has led to violence against the Jewish community for thousands of years. And that is a big issue. And that's the way you would have a conversation with somebody who says something who's particularly pernicious, not in an accusatory way, but just to say, you may not be aware that that type of stereotyping is bad. That type of stereotyping has led to violence against Jews. It's part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern. It's not in isolation. And that's the way that you can be an ally to the Jewish community if you hear that type of statement, or any community if you hear some sort of stereotyping.
Yeah, this is really resonating with me, because I'm thinking about some things I've let slide and look back on it and with regret and think, like, even if it's uncomfortable, it's a client or whatever, you've got to have a little courage, right? But let's move on to the next question. By the way, if people have their questions written out on cards, if you want to raise your hand, and I think people will come around and collect them, and we'll get to them when we're done with this segment. Our third question involves mental health. How are children being affected by exposure to these incidents? Name calling, conspiracy theories, both the victims and the bullies. We'll start with you, Dr. Salim.
That's a really good question. And in terms of mental health, the truth is we all are impacted by mental health, right? And considering we're post-pandemic, all of our mental health has been challenged. And when it comes to our children, they are the most vulnerable. And so they are experiencing mental health in a way that may not manifest that we're used to, right? And so it may come out in their behavior. And so those are things that we get to look at and be aware of. We also get to see that we talked a bit about social media. And in social media, oftentimes, violence, there's a culture of violence that children have access to. And so that is oftentimes manifesting in their behavior as well. And so we get to think about how our children, how that is showing up in their mental health. And mental health also impacts their learning, right? It impacts how they show up their school performance. It impacts how they relate to each other. And so in children, when it comes to mental health, they actually, when they see violence, how they do is they mimic that behavior. And so that's a way to let you know that some challenges are in the space. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay. And so I would really challenge us all to be mindful of our children, what they're exposed to, how they're relating at home, how they're relating at school. And so also thinking about mental health in terms of the dimensions of it. It's relational, it's spiritual, it's the environment. It's all those things that play a major role in the overall health of a child. And it's not just physical, but it's how they're feeling, right? And so an amazing late great Maya Angelou stated, she said, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel. And so for children, mental health is largely connected to how they feel. And so how they feel is connected to how they're feeling in the space, whether space is, in quote, safe, right? Whether it's courageous, whether it's relative, they can relate to you, whether they feel connected, they feel like they belong. And so these are all the things that connect to a child's mental health, and particularly bullies. We also need to know that, give them an opportunity to, excuse me, for restoration. And so children mimic what they see. And so although they may mimic violence, but we get to show them that they can undo that. They can unlearn violence. They can unlearn hate. And so it's really important that we present that to our youth. It's not just identifying what it is, but also letting them know that they can turn that thing around, and that we will rally together with them as a community and support them. And so when you see bullies, oftentimes the cycle of violence is a victim as well as an offender, right? And so bullies, if you dig deep and you get to the underlying issue, they probably have been victimized. And so they're repeating what they've experienced. And it's for us to really tap in and to see what's happening through their behavior, through their words, and who they're talking to. Thank you.
Sarai.
I would co-sign everything you just said. The only thing I'll add is my own personal reflection on this. I'm Indian American, and I grew up not too far down the road from here. And growing up, I remember all of the times, and there were many, where I was called names. And in my case, I was incredibly lucky that, frankly, that all it was name calling and not violence. And I know that many people are not so lucky, and I shouldn't call it lucky, because what I'm about to say is, I think all of that has stuck with me still to this day. And I remember what it felt like to feel other, to feel less than, to feel like I wasn't part of the community that I wanted to be part of. And that's, when I talk about the jokes or the microaggressions, all of those things have a significant impact on the person who's affected by them. They did in my case, because they lead you to feel other. And I still live with all of that even now, decades later. And so I think the impact, even of those small toss aside jokes, is not a toss aside for the person who's experiencing them. And particularly for kids who are experiencing them when they're at their most vulnerable, it can make you feel scared, and it can make you feel like your difference is a source of weakness instead of your strength and your superpower.
I'm not a mental health expert. I would just add one point, which is that, I think we do our kids a disservice by not more vigorously introducing anti-bias curriculum into the schools. You know, math, science, reading, all very important. My wife is a teacher, a middle school teacher, full disclosure, but I think it is so important. We also need to be creating young people who are learning in school in a formal way how to respect their own identity. What is their own identity? Actually grappling with what their or identities, people have multiple identities, and what's the identity of the person sitting across from them? And how do you build respect for your own identity and that person? How do you celebrate difference? Why should you celebrate difference? Why should you celebrate diversity? All of these kinds of things need to be grappled with in a formal way in schools. In 2019, actually it was the Division on Civil Rights, began a process, a task force, to look at youth bias in the schools in New Jersey. A predecessor to Sandeep, Attorney General Grewal put this in place. It took a year of studying the situation of bias in the schools in New Jersey. And after a year, they put out a 100-page report with 27 recommendations. Clear recommendation in there, one of those 27 was, we must have anti-bias education in all 1,600 schools in the state of New Jersey. Very, very important, and I would say really across the nation. You know, this is part of the work of our organization, and we'll talk about solutions later, but for me, creating this future where people respect one another is the most proactive thing we can do.
Yeah, we are going to talk about next steps in a few minutes. You know, this mention about bullying, you know, you hear that people who are abusers, physical abusers or bullies or whatever it is, were often the subject of that when they were children. You know, if they were beaten when they were kids, they grow up. Have any of you studied that in your data to see if there's some kind of causal thing there that these patterns, like within a family, repeat themselves generation by generation? Have you?
My work is centered around gender-based violence. And so oftentimes gender-based violence, it does start in the home because violence is also about proximity, right? And so, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question one more time?
No, I just, you know, listening to the discussion, you know, wondered if this is something that you had noted, that perpetrators of violence were, you know, earlier in their lives, the victims of it, and that vicious cycle just repeats itself over and over.
Absolutely. What we're actually alluding to is home life and potentially exposure, what it is like, what they're experiencing at home with their caregivers, whether it's through social media, whether it's through the relationships that are at home. And so they often mimic what is at home. And so we get to really engage those conversations about what's happening at home and how it trickles into this, to the educational space. And so there's definitely a correlation regarding what they repeat, what they see at home and then repeat at school.
Yeah. As I'm thinking about this, I'm also flashing on, you know, when I was a kid, I started to have some awareness of maybe some of my friends and their attitudes of their parents, especially racial stuff. You know, if the parents said certain kind of words or had certain kind of attitudes, you could see it trickling down to the kids. And so, you know, that's where, you know, all this starts at home, right? Even people being just mindful of little seemingly innocuous off-the-cuff comments that start to build in a kid's head, you know, a set of beliefs.
Typically it starts at home, right? So you're absolutely, you landed on a space, but also youth like to belong. They experience peer pressure, right? And so if they've been bullied in school, right, and they're tired of being bullied, then they become the bully. So they begin to embody those behaviors. And so, yes, we want to look at caregivers, but it's also the ecosystem that the child is surrounded around. And those are the things that we get to tap into as well. The home life, you get to tap into the educational space and all the other relationships that they have that plays a role in shaping their behavior.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on to where, you know, I hate to be flip, where the rubber hits the road for me, which is social media and the internet. And you started to touch on it before, but it seems like this is a key triggering force for what's going on. And what would you say a parent needs to know about what children are exposed to on social media and online? Why don't we start with?
Well, first of all, I spoke a bit about social media before, and I don't mean to scare people. Obviously, social media is here to stay. It's an important vehicle for communication, but you should know what's happening on social media. You should know what your kids are doing on social media. I know that's not so easy, but even having conversations with them about what they're doing, what they're seeing, who they're interacting with is very important. Social media is a problem. I don't mean to diminish it in any way. ADL has done many surveys on this. Our online hate and harassment survey, for example, shows that on average, about 40+% of the people using social media experience some form of harassment in any given year, and 27% of them experience severe harassment. Those numbers are higher for our teens. It's about 47% of teens who experience harassment according to our own surveys. That's very troubling. So you do need to be careful. And in terms of the type of harassment that they experience, often it's identity-based. So, talking about their race or their religion or their gender, that's the type of harassment that they're experiencing. I want to mention one other thing related to social media. It may feel tangential to you, but that's gaming. So, many people see games and gaming as something fun. They don't see it as being a form of social media, but it is a form of social media because these online multiplayer games they're a form of a network, and people are connecting in that way. And there's a lot of bullying that happens in those spaces. There's white supremacist activity. ADL has done a lot of work in the gaming space. You can look it up. But according to our surveys, about 10% of teens experience white supremacist activity in their gaming spaces. They can be approached by somebody. So what should parents do? Parents should understand who their kids are interacting with in the gaming space. Don't come in a judgmental way. Come in a way where you're just asking your children who you're interacting with, what are you experiencing in this space, and really understanding it. But you can do more. There are controls that can be put in place. Our surveys have shown the vast majority of parents don't use those controls, don't really know what their kids are doing. The only other thing I'll mention with regard to games is that it's not just about the kids. 83% of adults experience harassment in the gaming space. So I said 40+% in social media. It's much higher in the gaming space, and 60% of teens. So this is a bit pervasive, and really understanding it and not just seeing it as something fun is very important. This is now an enormous industry.
One of the things that makes social media particularly challenging is when you're on the internet and you want to find hateful content, for example, you have to go and search for it. But on social media, for students, for adults, you can come across some of that hateful content being a relatively passive consumer of content without affirmatively seeking it out. And I think that poses a real challenge, and it's what makes content moderation policies that social media companies have so important in this space. After the terrible Buffalo shooting last year that targeted a predominantly Black community in Buffalo, our Attorney General here in New Jersey took action to launch investigations of Twitch and Discord, to social media platforms, because I think there was real concern that the content moderation policies that those social media companies had weren't actually being adhered to. And when you have terms of service as a social media company, you've got to adhere to them. So I think it's incredibly important to recognize the role of social media companies, precisely because you can be on social media and be a passive consumer and come across that hateful content. And I think it's a particular concern as students younger and younger are on social media. And so this is something that our Attorney General and our whole office pays very close attention to.
Excuse me for 1 minute. Okay, excuse me. Excuse me. Excuse me. I appreciate people that this is. I appreciate that this is a emotional subject, and a lot of bad things have happened recently. There was a group of people that were involved in the planning of this. I'd like to finish with the agenda that we have. There's just one more question here before we're going to get to the audience questions. We asked for the audience questions so that we could surface these things. And I'd ask no single individual to feel that it's their role to stand up and interrupt the meeting and, take away from the entire program. Dr. Burton will be coming up at the conclusion, so she'll have an opportunity to respond. And we're almost done with the preset questions, and I have a nice pile of questions from the audience here. We specifically set aside time because we know it's important for people to feel that they're heard. So, and this is actually, ironically, a segue into the next question for our panelists. We don't expect our panelists to respond specifically to Millburn, but we brought them here for their expertise, and I think, by the way, you guys have been great. But here's our final preset question. What do you think we can do as a school district to support our families, our students, and our staff in addressing these issues? Why don't we start with you, Dr. Salim?
I think there are a variety of things that the community can do to really continue the work that you're starting here tonight. One of them, from what I'm hearing from the space, is having listening sessions where you actually give students, you give the youth, and you give the caregivers the opportunity to really voice the challenges that they're having and really be able to extract what their needs are, what their strengths are, and how we can move forward. I think that's one thing the community can do is listening sessions, and then begin to require comprehensive anti-bias education in public schools. So what you were speaking about, a particular curriculum that really speaks to how we can really speak against hate crimes and what it is regarding biases, and include that into the school district. Also address discrimination in the discipline, right? Have a clear, concise, succinct way of how we discipline those type of incidents in the school, right? Reduce racial disparities in identification, right? And so have representation as it relates to in the school, whether it be with disabilities, whether it be with LGBTQIA community, right? Take meaningful measures to diversify educators. Make sure that the educators look like the people that they're serving, the community that they're serving. Representation matters, right? Also, encourage K through 12 districts to designate a chief equity officer, right? Have an equity officer in place that understands the different things that's happening in the schools and meet those needs. And so designate a specific officer, a subcommittee, so those needs, those strengths can be identified and then trickle down into curriculum, trickle down into recreation, into community engagement. Also would say, in terms of holding everyone accountable, and those who weaponize the internet harm others. So we talked about social media, holding folk accountable that use the social media to harm, right? Bring that into account as well. Mandate completion of anti-bias education for educators, for staff, and like I said, include that in curriculum, and also include law enforcement into this training, right? Use this as a community engagement, really steer the culture in a way, right? So when we're talking about what's happening here, we're talking about culture, and culture is how you do things, how you work, policies and regulations and things of that nature. But we also need to talk about school climate. How do people feel when they're in this space? How are our children feeling? So we talked about mental health, and that's really important in this space. How are people feeling? And that's one of the things that we get to address when we have the chief equity officer, when we have these listening sessions, and such as community engagements and opportunities such as this. And then lastly, if I can add, to begin having service projects for all the students, the youth, to come together and work together collectively, right? So they learn how to be with each other relationally, as opposed to just getting information off of the social media and then painting with a broad stroke that everyone is the same way. They can actually be in relationship with people, develop feelings for one another, and that way we can kind of break down some of those prejudices. We can break down some of the hate that's happening in the school. And so I think these are some stepping stones that can really support you in moving towards shifting the culture here.
I want to lift up two of the things that Dr. Celine mentioned. And Scott mentioned this as well a little earlier on. Anti-bias education. We've got statewide curricular requirements with respect to anti-bias education, but that's a floor, not a ceiling. And I think there's a lot more that every school can do to ensure that students are getting that anti-bias education, so that teachers are getting appropriate training. At the Division on Civil Rights, we have an education and training unit that offers comprehensive trainings to educators across the state on, for example, understanding the needs of LGBTQ plus youth, or bystander intervention, or how to address implicit bias. And those are conversations that need to happen, and they need to happen as soon as possible within schools. Unfortunately, I think we are seeing across our state, across the country, a concerted movement in some schools to fight against those kinds of curricular mandates, to fight against anti-bias education. And I'll just say, it's been happening across our state in a whole host of communities, regardless of their political leanings and the like. And so it is something I think to be particularly vigilant about. The other thing I want to lift up is the importance of paying close and careful attention to school discipline practices and ensuring that school discipline practices are equitable for whether it's students with disabilities or students of color. And I think it's incredibly important to think not just about how we deal with bias incidents or hate, but how we build a more equitable school environment. I think school discipline is a critical part of that. And then when you're actually responding in the unfortunate event, and it in many school districts, I think is inevitable that you're gonna have an incident of hate. It's so important for the school community to immediately make a statement in response to what just happened, because to the extent that there has been an incident, people in the community are going to know about it, and silence is conspicuous in responding to these incidents. So speaking out is important, but it's not anywhere close to enough. These kinds of events can't be a one-off. You can't just engage with hate once and assume that the problem is going to go away. And so there has to be a continual engagement process, and there has to be a continual reevaluation of what are we doing, how is it working, and what can we do better. And there's always room for that improvement, and I think that continual engagement process is so vital to try and address what I think are really challenging forces that all of our schools across the state are facing.
So I'll pick up from there. I mean, certainly it's very important for leaders to speak out, whether it's the superintendent, whether it's the mayor, whether it's the faith leader in the community, elected officials, whoever it happens to be. Very, very important to speak out so everybody has a baseline, understands that this is not acceptable. But I want to tell you a story of something that happened a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, we had an incident. It was an LGBTQ incident. It was in a high school in our region, in New York, New Jersey. Parents came to us because they were very upset. Their child was being harassed, and they didn't know what to do about it. Part of the harassment was using social media to harass their child. So ADL stepped in, and ADL pressed the social media companies to do something about it. And this is what's very important. I want to answer the question that was asked before about what we do about social media. And, you know, there are content moderation policies on social media. It's very hard to get them to enforce it, but they do enforce it. Nobody wants their account suspended. Nobody wants their account revoked. Every one of us has the responsibility to report hate and misinformation online, teaching our kids how to recognize hate and misinformation online and report it to you and report it to somebody. You know, this matters. People don't want their accounts suspended, and if they know that somebody's looking at what they like, comment, or share, they're going to think twice about doing it. So all of us taking that responsibility is very important. The anti-bias education, I spoke about it before. But you know, there's so much more that can be done, and it's not just anti-bias education with the kids. It's also with the faculty. It's also with the parents. It could be a whole of community effort. Very, very important. You know, it starts, at least our programs, our anti-bias education programs start in the elementary school. So you know, you don't need to wait until high school to be introducing these programs. Also, Holocaust. Also, Holocaust education programs. Again, full disclosure, my wife is a Holocaust educator in her middle school. Her middle school has made an enormous commitment to this. 2 months out of the school year are devoted, one period of the day, 2 months are devoted to Holocaust education. They've made a very serious commitment, 1/4 of the class for each 2-month period. That matters. It's been shown that this type of education really has a big impact because it shows where hate can lead. It's not just about the particular story or narrative of the Jewish community. It's a narrative of where hate can lead. So I'm not saying it has to be Holocaust education, but it has had an impact. There are many steps that can be taken, but school needs to make that particular commitment. Yeah.
And I wanted to also add two things. Youth voices matter. And so we also get to include our youth, their voices. We get to talk to them, engage them, and see what their needs are. They can also identify what some of the solutions are for the problems that they're experiencing. So we get to engage them in this process as well as publishing resources. Access to resources is so incredibly important. So I wanted to just lift that up. The youth voice matters, and publishing resources.
So sounds like you are all aware, or your organizations or entities have educational materials, curricular programs, and other programs that you work with school districts and other communities on implementing these things.
So maybe I'll start. If you go to adl.org/education, you're going to find a wealth of resources for parents, for teachers. We have curriculum online. We have something called Table Talks, how to have a conversation with your kids about tough issues, whether it's about racism, anti-Semitism, the election, any kind of current event that's out there. Ukraine, we have guides about how to have tough talks about those issues. We have all kinds of the programs that I'm talking about, the anti-bias programs. The No Place for Hate program, by the way, which Millburn is a part of. No Place for Hate program is a completely free program. It's not free; it's paid for by our donors. But much of the resources that are online, the programs that we have, they're free. It's only when we bring in facilitators that there's a cost. So there's so much more that parents and teachers can be taking advantage of.
Okay, thank you for that. I know you have more to say, but we do want to get to audience questions. And actually, this is a good segue, this most recent part of the conversation, to the first one I was given, which has to do with allyship. And how do groups who are often targets of hate crime start to work together better to combat hate? How do groups who are often targets of hate crime start to work together better to combat hate?
Well, I think the first step is gathering together in a meaningful way where you can have conversation with other people who have different experiences than you. And I think that piece is so important because I think often we see and understand our own experiences, but we may not fully comprehend the experiences of others in our community, others that we may spend significant time around. And I think having those conversations in environments where there can be real, honest sharing between those communities, I think is the first critical step. But it's obviously not enough to ensure that communities are actually working together. And so I think there needs to be, even beyond that, opportunities for shared engagement between all of these communities to unite in I think in service of a common cause like this one, like One Millburn. I think it's not enough to just hear experiences from other people who may look different than you or believe different things than you, but also to make a commitment to one another that you're all going to work together to address this, and you're going to bring in your houses of worship, you're going to bring in other affinity groups. And I think having all of those folks at the table is really important as you unite on this kind of shared mission.
And I would just add to it, in the coming together, also recognizing that just because you come together and you have a commonality, you also get to learn how to be with each other with contrast. And so oftentimes when we come together, we get to respect that there are differences and you may not always get along and you may not see it the same way, but you can still work together and you can come together with a common cause of that we share this space we share the educational space, we have relationships, and we want to move forward. And so I think it's really important to learn how to manage contrast, right? Learn how to deal with that.
I agree 100%. I mean, people's particular identities are so important, but it's also important when it comes to hate that we universalize that. There is no distinction there, and we should all be concerned and upset when there's hate against our own individual faith or ethnic group or identity, but against other groups as well. I talk about this all the time. Universalizing hate is incredibly important. People can so easily say, oh, well, that's not me, that's not my group, so I don't really have to do anything about it. I don't have to speak up. I don't have to act in any way, and that's not true. You know, I often give the example of the swastika. You know, you take, and this is something that unfortunately now exists in so many of our schools. We deal with so many incidents of swastikas in the schools. It's like a constant stream. Every week, every few days, there's another swastika in a school in New York and New Jersey. The Jewish community takes that issue on in a big, big way. We see it as an affront. It's certainly triggering to the Jewish community because of our historical experience, but it's not just about the Jewish community. The swastika is a symbol of the Nazis. It's not a symbol of the Holocaust. It's a symbol of the Nazis. More than 400,000 Americans lost their lives fighting against what that symbol stands for. Americans, not Jews, but Americans lost their lives fighting against that symbol. So that symbol is not anti-Jewish per se, it's anti-American. It's against the values of everybody in this room, everybody in this country, and everybody should see it that way and see it as a problem for them and not just a problem for the Jewish community. And we need to universalize all forms of hate.
Thank you.
I'll add one other thing. Just on the issue of building coalitions, we have a very important coalition in this state. We have a formal memorandum of understanding with the NAACP. That is so important. We speak out with one voice on issues of both anti-Semitism and racism. And the power of those two communities, of our two communities, speaking out with one voice, it makes such a difference. We also go around the state speaking to different groups. We model how groups can work together on issues of fighting hate.
I'm going to add one more thing, if I can. And just be mindful of the populations that are vulnerable or most vulnerable. You know, rallying with those particular populations, those particular communities, and understanding that there's also intersectionality around gender, around race, and being present with them and rallying with them and understanding that, excuse me, and being clear about who's in your community, the vulnerabilities that they're that makes them more susceptible to hate crimes and prejudices, right? And I'm sorry, my throat is dry. Being mindful of what their experiences and the intersectionality around that, and putting some policies and some procedures in place to protect them. Like you said, universalizing, you know, practices around speaking up against hate. That's important to know that as well.
Okay. And I just want to call out Rabbi Goretz standing over there. So he did a program with Reverend Boyer. It was under the auspices of this NAACP ADL partnership back in February for Black History Month. So important. The two of them had an incredible dialogue about how the two communities can be working together to fight hate.
That's very important. Thank you. I've got one or two more, and then a few of the other questions are back to what direct action can be taken and how the school handles things. So since Dr. Burton's going to wrap up, I'm going to turn those questions back to her. But before we get to that, another one here is, can you speak to the connection between alienated or downtrodden individuals finding a sense of belonging or power in hate and hate groups? How can we combat this? Can you speak to the connection between alienated or downtrodden individuals finding a sense of belonging or power in hate/hate groups? How can we combat this?
Well, I'll add two things on this. One is, I think it's so important for educators, administrators, folks in the school community to understand what the signs of radicalization are in the first place, what the potential causes are. And this goes back to a conversation we were having earlier. Insecurity in the home. And that can be caused by a whole host of things. But that's one of the leading drivers of white supremacist radicalization. And it's really important for educators to know that so that they can look for that in their schools. And I think the other piece of this that's complementary is providing real meaningful supports for students that are potentially at risk. And I think this goes back to a conversation that we were having earlier about school discipline, right? When you see a potentially vulnerable student who's acting out, how are you going to respond to that? Are you going to respond with a punitive disciplinary practice? Or are you going to respond with providing that student with appropriate mental health supports, other kinds of supports that they need so that you can avoid some of those key drivers of radicalization?
I would just add that the other piece of this is controls. You know, it's also about knowing the kinds of social media that your kids are using. You know, are they using mainstream social media, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, whatever? Or are they using 4chan or Discord or the kinds of social media that do not have content moderation policies? You know, actually being involved in this part of your kids' life, trying to be involved in this part of your kids' lives. I have kids too. You know, it's not so easy, but some sort of controls. There are controls that can be put in place with regard to social media. You know, and of course I mentioned before about gaming. You know, so much harassment on gaming. There's so much white supremacist activity on gaming. And again, people see this as something benign because it's something fun. But really understanding who your kids are interacting with, who they're socializing with on these online multiplayer gaming spaces is very, very important.
Okay, last question before I turn it back. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Clearly, I think this is a very rich dialogue and important context, but at the end of the day, people want to know, what are we going to do? And we've been touching on that. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and since there's three of you, ask you for what we used to call in my old business, your single best idea in terms of a specific, concrete action you think that the community can take after tonight. 3 things that people can walk away from this conversation with. And I will throw that to anybody who would like to go first.
All right, so you know, I think I've given a bunch of ideas in terms of anti-bias education, in terms of social media, but one thing I didn't really talk about is the importance of reporting. So important to report these incidents. ADL keeps track of these incidents, but we only can deal with what's reported. We hear that it's underreported. If it's not reported to the school, if it's not reported to an organization like ADL, then people don't know about it. And if it is reported, you know, data drives policy. I can't tell you, the audit that I mentioned before of anti-Semitic incidents, it is quoted to me literally every day of the week by elected officials, by media. Those numbers are out there. I saw it today every single day. And people look for an uptick, or has it gone down? Has it gone up? Has it gone up a little bit? They look to see, and that matters. That reporting really, really matters. And of course, if you report it to the school, if there's data, you know, the school needs to be responsive to this data. It's so important to get the word out there that you must report.
I'd say have a clear playbook for how you are going to respond to hate when it occurs. We just at the Division on Civil Rights released a guide. It's a very short guide. It's 3 pages, and that's very intentional. The idea is to provide some meaningful guidance, non-legalese guidance for educators, other folks in the school community, so that they can start to develop a clear plan so that when one of these bias incidents happens, you know exactly what you're going to do. You know exactly how you're going to respond to the community, what stakeholders you're going to bring together, because the response to this can't be ad hoc. You can't just make it up as you go. You need to know what you're going to do when hate and bias materialize in your community, because as I said before, one of the most important things is being forceful immediately in the aftermath of a bias incident, in the immediate aftermath of hate in your community, making a clear statement and then having a plan for how you're going to handle it afterwards. And so I think having that clear playbook, and having that clear playbook not just for school administrators, but so that every teacher knows exactly what to do when they see hate and bias in their classrooms in the community.
Dr. Salim, the last word.
And I would say community engagement, recognizing that we are the work. The work is not outside of us. It is us. It starts in the home, and then it trickles into the classroom, the educational spaces, and so on. And so it's really important to know that we are all contributing to the solution. No one has the answer. This isn't a one fix, right? And so although this is a starting point, it's not the ending point, and healing is a continuum. And so I would say, how do we continue that? Listening sessions. There are opportunities to engage the community and really identify what are the needs, what's happening, what are the strengths, what are the solutions. You all get to identify what those solutions are, and we can incorporate that in a way that's best practice and best suited for all the people that's in the space, right? And then we can talk about restorative justice. Now that something has happened, there's been an infraction in our community, let's identify it, right? And let's restore the space. How do we do that? Come up with a collective plan, blueprint to restore the space, and continue that with some healing circles. It sounds like this space needs some healing, and you're not alone. This is a grand challenge, not that a challenge that Millburn is experiencing, but this is a national challenge. And so, but you all are courageous enough to look this thing in its face and say, listen, we need some work. We're willing to do the work. And we begin with listening, engaging each other. We begin by recognizing that restorative justice is needed in this space, and infraction has happened, and how do we mend that? And lastly, create a healing circle so people can see, listen, we're in this thing together. Our healing is tied together. We're better together than apart.
Thank you. So in conclusion, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for caring enough to come out here tonight, for your passionate participation, and for the questions you submitted. This has been an important part of the dialogue. One thing I've learned in various positions I've been in, and particularly when I finished my term on the school board at the last meeting, one of the other members of the board, you know, people go around and make some hopefully nice comments about you. And one of the people, members of the board, said that he felt, you know, that he had been heard, that I made him feel that he'd been heard. And that stuck, I've been off the board 9 years now, that stuck with me. It's important for people to feel that they've been heard, and hopefully we started that with this forum tonight. But I'd also like to thank our wonderful panelists here who have taken their time to come and share their deep expertise with us. Dr. Wafia Salim, Mr. Scott Richmond, and Mr. Sandeep Iyer. Thank you so much for coming here. I'm going to turn this back to Dr. Burton.
Question for the parents. Heard of tonight? No. Jeff, did you hear that? Question for the parents. Was it heard tonight?
So what I'd like to have is the opportunity.
This has been an hour and a half of order. I mean, serious. Who doesn't know all this stuff that they shared? It was worthless.
So this evening was one of many conversations. So I'd like to give some specifics, because it sounds as though in the conversations and the questions being raised. Just today, we had a meeting, a opportunity for our students, our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, to have a workshop in concert with our partnership with No Place for Hate that we have here in the middle school and the ADL, understanding really bias, prejudice, hate, it was a student version of understanding what this is, very specifically helping kids to understand. It's not just about just what you had on the program. It's not just about words. It's not funny. Oftentimes when students we're having to deal with investigations, they start out with, I was just kidding. They need to understand, and that's the work that we need to do with students. It's not funny, and this is the way in which these words cut through like a knife to those who are on the receiving end of it. Being more specific, the elements in the work with anti-bias, with hate, genocide, this permeates our curriculum. We start with children as young as they come to us in kindergarten, where it helps them to understand what is it about, in other words, being a good citizen, helping kids to understand and be an upstander. Because the reality is that we know that kids are hurting because they are not wanting to give up their friends in this wanting to belong, but we have to give them a space. So going to the curriculum, it permeates in social studies, where they hear about, again, the controversies that led to conflict, what goes behind those things. They're reading about them. They read books about various different varieties of authors. They then write about it and have opportunities to reflect on where they have been. I've seen this type of writing in our schools, in our classrooms, where kids reflect on, I have been on the receiving end of a microaggression. They understand what it is, and they have to be able to relate to it. Because if you understand as a student that you are on the receiving end of that, you begin to have more empathy when those words come out of your mouth that you think are a joke. But we have to teach kids. We are an organization. We are, and it's all kids, and they come in all shapes, sizes. The young people, parents, our staff. In our English classes, again, we're reading about the books and we're writing about it. They learn about it, the genocides, in their leadership classes, about what was the controversy, what was the hate behind that led to these conflicts. That's what they understand. I mean, we talk about those types of things and help kids to be able to understand what they mean, what has happened, because that's the citizenry we are trying to help to provide for in the future. As a district, the curriculum has to do the elements of acknowledgement, what it is, and teaching our students, again, about you've made mistakes, and as Dr. Salim has mentioned, how do we help kids to learn from those mistakes? Because they are kids, but when unfortunately, they don't understand the gravity of the mistakes that they make, and that's what we have a responsibility to teach them, the gravity of their mistakes. We have to give vehicles, and we have vehicles for students to share this information when they have had acts of bias, acts of hate that have been in any way, shape, or form detrimental to their learning environment. The littlest things to the biggest, the more egregious things. And if it hasn't been them directly, the upstanders, the kids who are bystanders, we have to give them the space. And we talk about them being trusted adults. And if they don't want to be the ones, we have say something. I get alerts 24/7. Say something alerts that makes me aware that there are things in writing or people who want to anonymously share information about kids who are saying mean things to kids. Because we put technology into our hands and we heard about the technology and the concerns about social media, we have to protect them. So we have safeguards behind the scenes on what kids are writing and the information and the sharing they are doing. As a school district, we have been engaged with this over several years with giving professional development. I can tell you that I've worked with staff and talked with them and said, I had a student come and said something in the past, I didn't know what to do about it. Today, I'm more equipped to be able to work with kids and say, I'm going to take them offline and work with them outside of, so as to we're not about shaming and blaming kids. It's not about shaming and blaming, but it is about teaching kids. And you have to work with kids to be able to help them to understand and take them aside and work with them to be able to speak to. Do you understand? Because I understand in talking with parents as well, kids are saying words they have no idea the impact. Both the aggressor and the victim have no idea the words that they are using. So I ask you, where are these words coming from is my concern. I can tell you that I've heard words that as an adult, I've not heard before spoken that are in our schools. So tonight, to answer the question that I've been asked, We're here tonight, and I engaged with the houses of worship to our leadership that says, we're here because we have to provide for the students of our district, and it takes an entire village. I will do my part to do what we need to be doing in this school district, but I need your help. We will be working next week with our Board of Education, and I'll be recommending to them that our work with as a goal for districts having diversity, equity, and belonging, because every one of our kids have to feel that they belong. And I use the phrase, before I shake your hand, and that's every one of our seniors. Before I shake your hand, I've got to do everything, and that's my commitment to this community, everything that I could do within my power tonight. And in going forward in the work that we have been doing to give kids the best education. And it's not just a platitude, it's not just nice to say. What am I doing? I'm spending time, and the amount of time we spent just to make sure the incidents that have happened, and there have been a collective incidents that have happened, we were not about going to lose any time and end this school year without taking a stand that says, we are one Millburn, and we have to collectively come together to work on this, every single one of us, those who are here and those who will hear my voice say this. That's what we need to do. So in going forward, again, we have created a One Millburn webpage that will include the events that will be forthcoming in our schools. We have many, and I will say that I already have had folks come to me and share that we have opportunities for speakers, having events, having activities. There will be many more such events. We want to do 10 times the number of people, because that's going to be the numbers who are partnering us that says this work is important. This will include events that will come forthcoming both in our schools, our town, our community. We've engaged in, as you see in the program, all facets of our community coming together to help with this work. It's just the beginning, again, of these efforts and part of our plan to implement proactive measures. This is not a one-time, one-hit wonder. To build those bridges and understanding across the many differences that we do have in our community. We are one Millburn. Thank you. And I, again, want to thank our panelists very much for coming and being part of this. They spent a lot of time with us in order to develop this. And again, Jeff, for helping to moderate. Thank you again, and thank you very much for coming out this evening.